I just wanted to ask some overarching questions here about the nature of buy now, pay later in Australia. So, what is the major consumer harm that is apparently being solved here with this legislation?
Senator, I might take that first. Diane here from AFIA. I think the main thing that is being done by the government here is to make sure that going forward, the whole sector, not just those who are code signatories to AFIA's Buy Now Pay Later Code of Practice, are covered by law. So first of all, a credit license obligation is in the proposed package. And then below that, there are a number of important standards which have been put into the Buy Now Pay Later Code of Practice a few years ago, but equally should apply across the sector more broadly. The first one is making sure that there is access to external dispute resolution, so through the AFCA model, if there is a problem, if things don't work out, and also to make sure that financial hardship provisions and attention to customers experiencing vulnerability is also captured in the law. We've been doing some good work with our members already, waiting for the laws to come in place. We've been doing some industry guidelines around financial hardship and vulnerable customers, and it's been really important work. I mean, we know that there is cost of living pressures for many Australians, but this is a good product that works through tough economic times and good economic times. So it's good to see that the government is taking a proportionate approach to the proposed legislation.
So it's not clear to me how your statement then and the statements of Ms. Lumsden can be both true. So maybe I'll ask you, Ms. Lumsden, why do you think, what is this trying to solve? Because your evidence is that this is going to make it harder for people to get access to buy now, pay later by making the product potentially unviable at the lower end.
Sure, happy to answer that question. I think that part of the answer is that there's been an evolution in the buy now, pay later sector over the years. When it started, the typical use case was that a consumer might be online shopping. They're able to check out using something like Afterpay or Zip.
Yep.
It would offer them the opportunity to make payments either on a monthly basis or perhaps for fortnightly instalments. Most of those purchases were routinely fairly small. The limits that were being offered were not particularly high. And so one can argue that there's a reduced consumer risk where consumers are taking on small amounts of credit for no or low cost. Because a lot of these products are either free to the consumer, it's wholly funded by merchant surcharges, or has a nominal monthly fee. What has happened over the years is that I've seen an evolution of those products into sectors with much more expensive items. So solar panels, furniture, I've seen wedding dresses. When you take an item that is worth $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 and you try and split it into, and I have seen this, 4 fortnightly instalments, that's a large sum of money that has to be paid each fortnight. Some of these products are obviously splitting that over a monthly repayment for a certain period of months. Some of those ones, though, however, are a bit more open-ended, or they have monthly fees which incur costs for the consumers. The larger the sum of money that is being used in these buy now, pay later products, the more it starts to converge with regulated consumer credit. And then it starts to become more of an argument that there's increased risk to consumers. So there's default fees. Some of these providers will charge reasonably hefty default fees, although there are some caps on those under the code, I believe. But the risk of default also goes up. So the implications for consumers' credit scores, credit reports and things like that. So I believe that the risk has evolved over the years. I think where it started, the risk was fairly low, but we've now moved into sectors where consumers are exposed to larger credit limits, higher risk of default, higher risk of being unable to pay and incurring fees that are related to those products.
So are you worried that this new regulatory burden is going to reduce choice in the market?
At the lower end of the market, yes. I think it's arguable that the higher end of the market should be quite highly regulated. If people are lending thousands of dollars, I'm not convinced that that shouldn't be subject to responsible lending. But if somebody wants to jump onto JB Hi-Fi, for example, and buy $200 worth of goods and split that into 4 $50 payments, I think that offers good consumer choice. It's a good alternative to high cost credit like credit cards, where we know that we have debt spiral problems. Debt spiral is less of an issue with these low and no cost products for smaller amounts because the fees are capped or there are no fees. I don't think it's necessarily a better outcome that consumers shift that spending pattern into credit cards with high interest rates, where there is a higher risk of them being caught in a debt spiral or incurring large costs.
Right. That's right. Of course, the whole point of these products is to give consumers choice, because there are some people a credit card might not be what they want and it might not be the best thing for them. So it sounds like a reform looking for a problem to solve to me. But I might come back to you then, Ms. Tate. So, Ms. Tate, so what about the code of conduct for buy now, pay later? Has that been an effective piece of self-regulation?
Absolutely, Senator. I said in my opening remarks it was a world first a few years ago. We've already informally reviewed it once, formally reviewed it, and have been updating it. So it's been a living document in the last few years, reflecting changes in the buy now, pay later sector, domestically and internationally. It's also influenced international standards, which is something I think that, Australia should be proud of. It's not only invented the BNPL sector itself, but it's also been influencing how things are being managed from a regulation and industry standards perspective. You would expect as industries evolve and develop that good codes of practice can lead to the first iteration of law, and that's what we're seeing here.
Okay, and so what are the average fees in the buy now, pay later products?
Look, there is a range of fees and there's also fee caps in our code. So I might ask my colleague Sebastian to jump in on the details here. But we have seen fee income for buy now, pay later providers reducing over the last few years. The law picks up on some of the fee cap model from our buy now, pay later code and puts that into the law to ensure that there are limitations. But the most important thing, I think, as we get through to the regulations and we really explore fee caps there, Senator, is making sure we acknowledge the diversity of the sector. As my legal colleagues have just been outlining, there is a very different business model between low value, low risk models and the higher value products. So we just need to be careful that we don't hit an own goal there and make this product difficult across that spectrum. But Sebastian, would you like to add to my comments?
Thanks, Ms. Tate. And thank you, Senator Bragg, for your question. Obviously, as Ms. Tate indicated, fees will vary across products, and in many cases, if you make all of your payments on time, you will actually have no fees. So as our BNPL economic impact report shows, in many cases, consumers are actually saving money by using BNPL products instead of other financial products. So for example, in FY 22-23, it's estimated there are gross savings for consumers of $422 million through lower fees, no interest and other competition and convenience benefits. Specifically though, under the BNPL code of practice, which covers 90% of the sector as it stands, on page 19 of our code, we cap fees at $250 in the first year and $125 in subsequent years. We got out on the front foot in doing that in March of 2021 through the BNPL code, and it is consistent with the caps in the National Consumer Credit Protection regulations. One thing I would note is that those caps have not been increased since 2010. So whilst they're currently $250 in the first year and $125 in subsequent years, if they had been adjusted for inflation, they would actually be $350 and $175 respectively.
Okay.
However, as I said, we're on the front foot in introducing those caps, and they're consistent with what is in the credit laws as they exist, and also consistent with what's being proposed in Regulation 69E of this legislative package. So we're supportive broadly of capping fees and promoting consumer savings as our economic impact research shows.
Okay, that's very helpful. So look, first, finally, I just want to come back to you, Ms. Lumsden. So what about, you're concerned about the debt factoring models here, are you? So are you suggesting this should be an amendment that the Parliament should consider in its final analysis?
I think that if Parliament wishes to regulate this sector, it should give some consideration to the debt factoring model. I know that there's anti-avoidance provisions that have been proposed, but there are some providers who work on a debt factoring model where the merchant will offer the BNPL product on a white label basis. That wouldn't be caught by the proposed law as it stands because of the definition of BNPL, which involves a third party. And then the merchant incurs they provide the loan notionally to the consumer, and then the debt factor or technically the correct buy now pay later provider buys that debt. So they never make an extension of credit to the consumer, which is why it would fall outside the proposed drafting as it stands. But functionally, they are doing the exact same thing as other buy now pay later providers. It's just a different legal model to affect the same outcome. It was largely done for branding purposes. There was no sort of intent to circumvent any law or anything like that. But nevertheless, it is a model that is in the market. And if it is not picked up by these reforms, there will be a sector of the market that can continue to operate completely unregulated, which would obviously create regulatory arbitrage, which I think is always a concern when we're legislating.
Yeah, well, it sounds like more regulation, more costs, and maybe fewer choices. So thanks for that. Thank you, Chair.